Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young, and it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Hello, I'm Karen Christensen, and I'm joined by two former classmates of mine for an exciting, for us, a very exciting topic. I'm here with Kia Penso and Bob Blaisdell. We decided to do this today to talk about the novels of Anthony Trollope, and also about the person who introduced, I think, all of us to Trollope. His work is timely, timeless, and so and I happen to have these old friends who have read Trollope and who I've certainly seen write about Trollope in ways that I found really enlightening. But here's our question: when did you first read Trollope, hear of Trollope, and read Trollope? I'll ask both of you that.
All right, I read Trollope for the first time in Mr. Mudrick's, I'm sorry, I call him Mr. Mudrick, and Writers at Work class, where the texts were the Paris Review interviews, somebody else's collection of contemporary writers' interviews, and Trollope's autobiography. And the assignment, the term assignment was to choose one of the writers from the interview or Trollope and read a couple of major works by that author and discuss them in relation to how they seemed in the interview, or Trollope in relation to his autobiography. So Kia suggested to me The Last Chronicle of Barset, maybe because, Kia, you had just read it. And so that was the first novel I read.
Oh, you read the last one first.
I read The Last Chronicle, and it was, even though it was in one of those nice little editions, it was, 800 pages long.
Right.
and I read a book of short stories by Trollope, and I was hooked. And I immediately wanted to divorce my PhD focus, which was Thomas Hardy and his novels. But it was too late.
Oh, so you were in grad school doing something?
I was in grad school, yes.
Oh.
That course with Mr. Mudrick.
Because it sounds like a great course. I would have, but I don't remember any course like that. So, Kia, you had read Trollope before Bob.
I did. And I think the first Trollope novel I read was the combination, The Warden and Barchester Towers. And I read those as an undergraduate, almost in my first year at the college. It was in a student-conducted seminar taught by Chris Kellett. You probably won't appreciate the plug. I don't know. Anyway, I read it, and then I didn't get it. We read a lot of these big, chunky Victorian novels. It was a course on the Victorian novel. And honestly, I was so happy to be in creative studies. I wasn't paying attention to anything I was reading. I was totally paying attention to the people because of the people that were in that class. It was just a student-conducted seminar by another undergraduate. And it was this array of stellar, amazing people. And that just kind of absorbed my first 2 years in the college. So it was really when I was in grad school, probably because of Mr. Mudrick mentioning Trollope, that I reread Barchester Towers, and then I was completely hooked. In fact, it was because he taught a course on, I think it was the Victorian novel, because we read Martin Chuzzlewit and Great Expectations in Middlemarch, and probably Vanity Fair, although it's hard to imagine him. And I remember him reading Jane Eyre, because he was so funny about Jane Eyre. Sorry, this is Mr. Mudrick, not Trollope. Trollope would have been funny about Jane Eyre.
I can only imagine.
You said Mr. Mudrick, when he was reading passages from Barchester Towers, laughed so much he was crying.
Yes. You remember that? Because that's true. The two books that did that were Barchester Towers. Everything to do with Signora Visi Neroni. Like, I remember him telling us that the Visi family, the Stano family, that they were They were basically the people that Henry James wrote about without realizing that they were funny.
But the comedy was brought out by Trollope.
He apparently thought that he ought to take these people very seriously. And of course, that was another thing another point against Henry James was that he couldn't see that these people were funny.
Right. Now, just to place this for listeners, we're talking about Marvin Mudrick, who was a well-known kind of renegade U.S. critic who died in 1985, I believe. 86. 86. And so we were students of his. I was a student from 79 to 81, so fairly briefly. And then you guys were both undergraduates and graduate students there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you knew him over a much longer period than I did.
Yeah. And Bob was taking a lot more classes with him than I was. I was kind of in and out, but essentially so Bob was taking a lot of classes with Mr. Mudrick, and I was doing fewer. But what happened was grad school was so boring for me, mostly. And I discovered that you didn't really have to work very hard at it at all. And if you wanted to get an education, if you really wanted to get an education, you couldn't only do what they were telling you to do. You couldn't go to the class with the dumb teacher and write the dumb paper and expect to learn anything. And in any event, this has a bearing on Trollope. And Bob, you can just tell me to shut up and stomp right in over whatever I'm saying.
I'm happy remembering.
But the thing was, like, I began on this hungry reading. Also, there was another reason for the hungry reading, which was people couldn't stand to have me in their classes, like, because I was so fidgety. And so it was like, oh heck, I somehow or other I've got to read enough to where I know enough to where I can sit. It was like I've got to teach myself how to be like able to be here. So I started pursuing hungrily this whole other alongside curriculum of reading in parallel with all the little bitsy bits of rubbish that they gave you in grad school. So, you take a class of literary theory, something like, methods of literary criticism. And then I would be like getting in arguments with the teacher. And then off in the background, nobody knew I was reading the entire works of Chekhov, every word. Or, the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon, devouring those. And that's actually what got me through grad school, was all this extracurricular reading. And when I hit on Trollope, it's kind of like, I know Bob had the same experience. It was like, oh my God, I'm going to be entertained for the rest of my life.
And I must say, that's sort of my experience.
From that day, you knew you had found the perfect traveling companion. The perfect traveling companion. I do not travel anywhere without a Trollope novel in my luggage.
And the three of us, I mean, you guys are different. I'm very different. We all have this, and that's what I thought would be so interesting to convey. There's something really special here. And obviously, Mr. Mudrick, I mean, he's known as a ferocious critic.
Yeah.
And people were terrified by him, not just his students, but writers were. I mean, he got up the nose of a lot of people. But he loved Trollope. When he loved a writer, he didn't hold back. And his, I mean, it's quite breathtaking. I pulled out a couple things. You may have read the piece. He wrote a review of the short stories, and I find I've never read them. And he's talking about them. I've never read one of them, I don't think. And
for a treat.
Yes. Obviously, because he's so enthusiastic, but it's so much about women. He's always writing about women in power, which is
the subject.
And so I am enthralled. So, I mean, there's actually something still that I have never touched, instead of just going back to the novels I really do love. What I want to get at, why do we feel like this? What is it about Trollope? I mean, actually, could one of you just, Bob, you read and studied the autobiography. So for people who don't know Trollope, can you explain why he became the autobiography made him kind of controversial as a writer? Because he was, He didn't fit the mold, did he?
Well, that's what I learned, but that was completely the opposite effect on me.
Mm-hmm.
It made me interested in him. It had more influence on me than maybe any other book but Anna Karenina. That the doggedness, and you have a job, but you write for 3 hours every morning, and you can produce novels. And he made no claims for their merit. He was very proud and happy of their success and the money, and it made it seem like a possible life. And anyway, he knocked down things for me, and so I know supposedly the autobiography made him what's the word? He took away the mystery, but he'd already kind of gone off
the artistic mystique or whatever.
He'd already lost bollocks, you know.
He lost his time. Even by the end of by the time he died, he the money he was getting for his novels was half. And so the more I've read about him, he didn't really disappear. And I think he's just there to be discovered, and he's a treasure ship. I mean, I like about traveling with him, but it was like discovering this ship full of gold. And
because the stories the books are so big, and the number of characters that, you know, and you come back and you go, oh, right, her. And this thing. But I came across in the Mudrick Transcribed, which is a collection of, as you both know, collection of edited transcripts of Mudrick's classes, which were in themselves a memorable experience. But apparently a student asked something about how do you find time to write? And so Mudrick's thing said, I have never seen a bad piece of writing by Trollope, all very elegant, often brilliant. Where did he find the time? Well, he told you. He told you in his autobiography, 2.5 hours a day. He says everywhere he went, traveling, writing all the time, both directions. On the way over there, he'd be writing a novel. On the way back, be writing a novel about the place he just visited. They're wonderful. They're wonderful. His book on the West Indies is wonderful. The book on Australia is terrific. So don't give me any shit about not having any time.
Yeah, I want to say something to that about what Bob said about reading Trollope and thinking this is how you do it, and this is a transformative experience for him. And I'm thinking, yeah, I read that and I thought, wow, shit, I don't know, but Bob is like the only person I know who could read that and not be discouraged. And because he's the nearest thing to that kind of worker that I know, and this accounts for what is now actually like a really solid body of work. And a lot of that work is really kind of investigating how what Trollope does gets done. Trollope does something. There's a reason why he's so entertaining, and one of the reasons is I think about, you know, that thing that Lawrence said, the novel is the one big book of life, that I'm probably misquoting. And Trollope gets everything into the novel, almost everything. There's some things happen to the novel that can mean that they can never come back into the novel. Like you can never have anybody using the toilet in a novel because Smollett like buried that. If you didn't want to be Smollett, you couldn't have anybody go to the bathroom in a novel because it ended with a chamber pot emptied on somebody's head. And that was, you couldn't have anybody go to the toilet for 200 years. And so, but the novel between Sterne and Smollett and Richardson, you discover this tremendous plasticity of this form, that it can travel, we learned from Sterne, for instance, at really different paces over its terrain. You can go at a gallop in a straight line, but you can also stop and sort of spread in this very lyrical and leisurely fashion laterally while moving very slowly, and you're it seems to be going at the natural pace of your own rumination. And Trollope, the beauty of Trollope is that his pace is almost always exactly right. You feel like you're breathing when you're reading Trollope, but you're thinking and it doesn't feel like thinking. It's just, and there's something about that when that happens, like you feel something flip in your guts when you open that book and you feel that narrative catch. And you go, I'm going to be thinking in an interesting way for 800 pages.
I'm just going to be with them. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not the number of pages. It's how you travel. It's how many interior terrains there are in there. You're going to have a moment when somebody is in a state of tremendous excitement. You're going to have a high moment like the Mrs. Prudy's. What the heck did she call that thing, that entertainment she had?
The conversación.
The conversazione. You're going to have a high moment like that. Or you could have something like you get in some of the sort of less well-known novels, like, a little disquisition on having catered dinners, thinking you're impressing people with catered dinners. Remember that?
Great one. How could we at 800 pounds a year, we just get, the greengrocer in to help. We can't, the food's all cold.
Yep. And all of this, it fits. It's like there's this idea. And again, I'm throwing this back in the general direction of Bob, right? But, Bob put me onto Ruskin a few years ago, and I have not read as much Ruskin as Bob, but I've really enjoyed it. And one of the things I get I don't agree with Ruskin's opinions about anything.
No.
But
this
keeps happening with a lot of critics I like. But I get this feeling that Ruskin understands something, which is like something I call the decorum of a work of art, that a work of art has to have decorum, and that he's kind of a fuss budget and neurotic, and things that are outside of decorum make him very uncomfortable. But what you discover with Trollope is something like what you discover with Mozart, is that they give the impression that the decorum of the novel is infinite, of their medium is infinitely expansible. It can hold everything. If a volcano went off in Mozart, it would somehow or other still be music. Right? The continuity of the musical fabric would not break. And Trollope's fabric holds like that. You never feel like you've been dumped out of that world, bruised and embarrassed at being such a dummy, like you do with clever novels,
Dandy. That's great.
So, yeah.
So dive in to talk. I mean, we can talk about your favorite novel.
Yeah. So
that would be fun.
Bob.
Well, it changes over time. And I would have said, because I've read them all, and I think I've read almost all of them twice. After reading all of them, there were only a few that fell off the list. I was like, I don't need to read The Fixed Period again. I don't need to read Love and Day again. Well, only a few fell off the list. After the second round, others, when I see on the shelf, I'm like, I'm not going back. But the ones I've read at least a few times include Ayala's Angel. I just reread Phineas Finn and Phineas Redux and The Prime Minister and The Duke's Children, because the election was coming, and I didn't know why Trollope would help me understand the politics, because I'm very naive about politics and not knowledgeable. He made me understand things that I hate about the politics.
I read The Pallisers during the 2016 election just to kind of remind myself that people have done bad and stupid things at other times too. The humanity of it, for good and ill, is so clear.
Yeah. So I don't know. And there's Orley Farm, for some reason. I keep coming back to Trollope in the autobiography. He thinks he says he flubbed it because it's too early in it. Maybe 500 pages out of the 750 pages, it comes out that indeed she forged the will. And it doesn't matter. It didn't matter. As Kia says, he can manage that too. He can spill the beans, and the novelist it's then about the beans having been spilled and how the lawyer has to deal with it and how she deals with it being revealed. He's never. I like very much what you said, Kia. Is that he's never thrown for a loop, and so whatever comes to him, he accommodates, and the characters surprise him. And I also, one last dig at Hardy. I mean, I still haven't forgiven Thomas Hardy for killing Tess and the D'Urbervilles.
Oh, yeah.
And my counterexample was from immediately when I read Trollope's autobiography. He couldn't kill Kate Woodard in The Three Clerks. She just keeps putting it off, and then he's like, "No, I'm not going to kill her." I mean, it was part of the plan.
I have to reread The Three Clerks. I remember I loved it, but I've forgotten the details now.
He didn't let her die, and that won him. One of the many things that how he won me over.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Kia, what's your favorite?
Boy, Framley Parsonage was a long-time favorite, but the last time I tried to read it, the fate of Adolphus Crosby made me so miserable. It was like, okay, well, this is Trollope's vision of hell, obviously. The nearest thing to a vision of hell is Adolphus Crosby's marriage. And I got all the way up to there, and then when that marriage just started heading south, as it were, it was like, oh, I can't bear this. This is too terrible. Isn't that sad? Isn't that weird? Mm-hmm. So Barchester Towers is still high up there. I read Barchester Towers because for me, that's pretty much it's like one long sustained note of joy.
Yeah.
The thing about Trollope, I mean, I'm not saying he's a perfect artist, because there are patches where you kind of go, well, I wish he hadn't gone on so long about this very tedious parliamentary procedure, and why am I among all of these boring ass guys in suits? But this is about taste. Whatever he's doing, he's executing it as well as it can be done, and thoughtfully, always thoughtfully. So I think after that, probably The Last Chronicle of Barset, which for me is kind of like some sort of lifetime ordeal. I get to the end of it and I'm always in tears. And those two. And then for me, there are just good bits, like in Framley Parsonage. Sorry, I should have said The Small Cottage at Allington.
Oh, The Small House at Allington.
The Small House at Allington is the one with Adolphus Crosby's miserable fate.
Yes.
Framley Parsonage is the one where you get this glimpse of Mrs. Prudy from Barchester Towers at home and not in her full battle gear. This is Mrs. Prudy at the breakfast table basically in her curlers. And and it's just wonderful. And then there's things like, there's little things. And then all these formidable older women, or women who don't even know they're formidable, like Miss Mackenzie.
Yes, Miss Mackenzie, Lady Lufton.
Yes, and the lady the Earl Grey's sister.
Oh,
Lady Julia. Julia.
Yes. Oh, Lady Julia.
These sort of
awesome character.
These ironclad little spinsters who everybody's afraid of because they know how to wield the power that they have.
Yeah.
And
the heart of gold underneath.
Yeah. And they fear nothing because they are absolute believers in the power of their respectability, and that makes it work. So there's that scene when I think is it Lady Julia? She accidentally meets the Duke of Omnium, a person who she refuses to have anything to do with. He's the richest man in the country. Everybody is in awe of him. And they run into each other in the doorway, and everybody's really interested about how this little moment's going to go because they know she hates him. And she does this curtsy, this deep curtsy, and her skirts just billow out around her. And she gives her this deep curtsy, and he can't do anything. He recognizes that this curtsy, as deep and as apparently abject as it is meant to convey her total disapproval and contempt of it. And it does. And there's nothing anybody can do. He's just beat. And she's, there's just like these little set pieces all over the place. Or the opening of Miss Mackenzie when she there was this whole class of these, these single women who never got to get married, and it just became their job. It was like, well, oh look, old Uncle Crackpot is going to be slowly dying of some mysterious ailment. She's going to lie in bed and be cranky for 20 years. Well, I tell you what, Miss Mackenzie isn't married. You go take care of him. And that was it. Everybody decided that. And then they were just stuck. Well, I think it's Frances Fitzgerald, maybe, who wrote a whole book about these women and what they did after they finally escaped. And some of them had these really wild adventures. But Miss Mackenzie just has Trollope adventures. She doesn't go to Africa and convert anybody or go mountain climbing in Tibet or anything. She just goes to Bath. And there's this scene. It's like one of my favorite Trollope set pieces, where it's like you realize that he's playing off of an old genre of literature, which is the story of the young girl from the country, the young innocent maiden from the country who poverty maybe drives her into the metropolis to look for work. And she runs into a lady who says, oh, I'll get you work as a seamstress, my dear. And the next thing you know, she's locked up in a house of ill repute. And Trollope flips this by having Miss Mackenzie meet all these other old ladies, all these very respectable old ladies. And the big temptation that they're drawn into is this tea parties at the house of this Bible banger minister. And they all go and sort of sit at this young guy's feet, and he's sort of
Bible
creepy.
bangers of the day, the religion.
He hated them.
They're greasy and but you can see that. But he really works to try and convey the charm or charisma that draws
very much
people to
this them. Is exactly it. This is the seduction of Miss Mackenzie. She's been drawn in by all these other victims, as it were. Eventually she gets away from them because no bad endings for anyone he loves. But that moment is just very funny. You realize it's being written about in that same sort of woo tone,
Yeah.
And it's great fun. And so there's just lovely things anywhere. Every time Lady Glencora Palliser opens her mouth, you're just like, joy, joy, joy. Do it to it, lady.
She's a fabulous
genius.
Character. And
she's not supposed to be. She doesn't have to be.
She is Trollope, you can tell, pushes situations so that she will enter the scene.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, if I do this, I can work her in.
See, and to me, that's something about, a lot of talk about like creative writing is about technique. It's about how. And, the only thing that puts her there is a why, not a how, a why. He puts her there because he loves her.
Yes.
And he wants us to love her too.
We're going to love her because we're going to love her
with him.
Yeah. And we're going to love her because he's placed her there with love. And that's sort of the magic of the novel. You will love what the novel loves.
Let's talk about his writing, because I find it fascinating to think. This, I gather, is true of George Eliot too, that these, we have word processors and we do drafts and, plan things. But Trollope sat down for his 2 or 3 hours every morning and wrote 250 words per hour, and when it was done, so this would be by hand on pieces of paper. And when they were stacked up, they went to a printer. I mean, I think he went back and read over and probably marked it up a little bit. But for a modern writer, it's hard to imagine that. And to think that these books that have endured all this time were composed in that way. How do you think he did it? And just all the richness of the detail, the people. I mean, do you think because he was living another life, because he lived a large life?
Bob? So, the first half hour of his 3 hours every morning was rereading what he wrote the day before.
Yeah.
So he said partly just to get back in that flow. And when he talks about his writing for the post office, for which he wrote thousands and thousands
Yes.
of reports and letters. He said he thought he should be able to do it in one draft, and he didn't really believe in drafts. He just did it.
I love that.
Did it, and that one set. And when he was sitting down to the novel, every morning, he was in the place where he wanted to be, and he was writing his own writing. He was just, it was coming to him. He had it. He talks about some of the difficulties and some of the jams he got into because he didn't plan very much. He didn't plan very often. You just start in, and that's why
with something like the last Chronicle of Barchester. Did he have that plot? That's a fairly intricate plot. You know, with the money, the problem with the check. Did he work that out in advance? It seems like he must have.
I don't think he did.
I don't think so either.
And it's not even resolved in the novel. Because we don't know if Mr. Crowley, he lets it be the mystery of everyday life. You don't know if you did it.
The man, well, that Mr. Crowley didn't do it, but we don't know exactly how, because the man from the inn ran away to Australia or something.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't think he worked it out. He didn't mind writing himself into corners because the corner is also part of life, and the difficulties for the characters. He got himself. I mean, certain painters, all they need is the spur of like, there they are standing in front of the canvas, and they make things happen.
And do you know why he wrote the two sets? There's a Barchester set, and then there's the Pallisers. Was that planned?
No, he didn't think of that way. It was just a chance to go back to them. And I mean, the Palliser novels are written quite separately from one another. And the plot of Can You Forgive Her, the first one, is from a play that he wrote before he'd had a successful novel. And
I love Can You Forgive Her? Actually, that character. It's Anne or Alice? Alice Vassar.
Alice
Vavasseur. Yeah. I think she's really interesting from a modern point of view, because she was a woman who loved, but who didn't want to be stuck in the country and wanted to, have some influence in the world and to be part of the world. And I find her one of his more interesting characters.
But when I first read that one, and I was interested in her, but as soon as Glencore makes her appearance and Burgo Fitzgerald, and as soon as they do, Trollope is like kind of drops out, because this woman is more interesting. And
yes, they're two of a type. I mean, for me, they both have this yen. I mean, Lady Glencore to be part of the world and to be active, or the tragedy of Lady Laura Kennedy. In Phineas Finn, and I guess the Phineas Redux, women who have aspirations to have political influence in the world, but for whom it goes horribly wrong. I think his sensitivity to the situation women found themselves in.
Which one was your favorite, Karen?
Oh, I do love Can You Forgive Her? And I just love I love the Palliser series, I guess I would say. I find Phineas Finn really interesting. I find Phineas Finn interesting because he is the, there's always so much, and it's very clear in Trollope novels, the way in which women used whatever they had, whether it was family beauty first, charm, family connections, money, to, they had to make, it was difficult to make their way in the world and to find happiness for themselves. And if they were beautiful, that was a huge help. If they had some money, that was also a help. But Phineas Finn, there he is in a situation that's rather like a lot of women, where he was didn't have much money, and he was from Ireland, but he was very attractive and charming. And he rose in the world because of his personal assets more than his political acuity, I would say.
But the interesting thing about his personal assets, he's completely unaware of having them.
Yes.
He doesn't realize how beautiful he strikes people.
Yes.
His beauty strikes people. You're barely aware of it yourself. You
Yeah.
don't know, like half the time you're reading it and you're thinking, what is it about this guy? And it's just that he's good and beautiful
Yeah.
and not stupid, sort of naturally candid nature.
Yes.
And trustworthy.
Good-hearted, and he obviously exerts, has considerable charm for women.
Yeah.
But also
women go
men.
great lengths for him, but men trust him.
Yeah.
Men find themselves trusting him, find themselves. And there are such people. There are people like that who they turn up. But it's interesting because he's not using it.
Right.
He doesn't know what, and that's an interesting thing because we're supposed to use things.
Mm. And women were, I think, to a much greater extent, they were taught to, they had to. What did they have? They had whatever they had to use that to place themselves in the best position they could, as when they grew up.
Up to a point, because a lot of the time it isn't all about that. A lot of the time it isn't about a woman placing herself in the best position that she can be in. In the way we live now, what's her name? The heroine, Felix Carberry's sister.
Oh, yes.
The best position for her would obviously be to be married to that squire cousin of hers out in the country who's solid, got every single thing that's wrong with her family is all square and right with him. Yeah. She doesn't want him. She wants to marry a guy with no money.
Yeah.
So, and that she's not going to budge from that no matter what they do to her. And so she's not there. They're not always looking for the best in those terms. There are ambitious women. And
they're not. Yes, they're not necessarily looking for power and money. They may be looking just to find a place where they can be happy too.
Or they may, and because Trollope really believes in this, they may really be in love with someone and feel like the fulfillment of her nature is through the marrying and being the partner of the man that she loves and going with him through whatever he goes through.
Yeah,
if
and
it's
sometimes
poverty,
they're
then poverty.
quite touching relationships, Sean. But he also portrayed, I think of I can't remember, Lucy, who marries Lord Lufton at finally, and they just seem so right, and it's really lovely. Mm-hmm. But he also is very much aware of how terrible a bad marriage can be, as we were saying, some really grim ones. Well, so it's like this full range of things.
The Earl, who's the father of Alexandra de Courcy, the Earl de Courcy, remember that's a really dreadful marriage,
Yes.
Sort of just this drunken, angry, old gout-infested, complete bastard.
And the children in that family.
It's just a horror show.
They're just one after the other stars in their own.
They're like that. They're like that Monty Python bit about the world's most horrible families. Remember that one? Except I've got the name wrong.
Or
maybe it was that John Walters movie. They could be in there,
Mm-hmm.
But I was also thinking somebody like, I feel like to me, somebody like Archdeacon Grantley is all the reason you need to know why there are like 4 or 5 Barchester novels. I lost count of the exact number off the top of my head. But you just, like, I love him. I love Archdeacon Grantley. I think the first time you meet Archdeacon Grantley, you see the fever of ambition in him. And the next minute he's on his knees asking for forgiveness for having let it go too far.
Yeah.
He's down on his knees, acknowledging his sin, and
it's a gorgeous opening to it.
What an introduction to the guy.
Yeah.
And then you see him, he's like, he's impossible, but he's really good. And that's, to me, that's interesting. He's a good person who, who's loaded with prejudices, all kinds of prejudices. You never doubt that he's good. If a large component of goodness is the ability eventually, maybe dragging yourself, kicking and screaming, to totally acknowledge your own fault and do whatever you need to do to get it right. But also just the fight in him is so wonderful, even when he's completely wrong-headed.
Completely
Just the
wrong.
fight in him is great, you know?
What do you think, Bob, about the religious? Because he's one of the many characters who, from their Church of England, and then they're what do you call them? The low church, the more evangelical type. So obviously quite a significant part. I was startled by how important that. But what are your thoughts about what is Trollope trying to tell us? Or is he trying, is it just the life it's what he saw going on?
No, this is the Civil War still being fought.
What do you mean, Kia?
What I mean is the battle lines in Barchester Towers and in some of the other ecclesiastical novels where you run into these low church characters.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Civil War still. This is like the Civil War, the English Civil War is comedy. This is the English Revolution as comedy, and everything that comes with it. It's this split, and the society is kind of stitched back together over this split. And oh my God, this is Mr. Slope and Mrs. Prudy are obviously the Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
Archdeacon Grantley is obviously a Roundhead. I mean, not a Roundhead, sorry, a Cavalier, very much in the Cavalier spirit. I mean, it's so just like jumping right out at you, like these are the descendants of those battle lines.
But
those
they're
fighters.
Still part of the Church of England, and then
They
there's
are
the
still,
Methodists
the
as
split
well.
the split happened within the church. Well, I mean, look at the way Trollope treats the Methodists. Remember, in the West Indies and the Spanish Main, he goes to Jamaica. He goes to St. Mary, the parish of St. Mary on the north coast of Jamaica. How the heck he got all the way over there, I don't know. Anyway, he's over there, and there's that scene that Mr. Mudrick just loved, where he meets this beautiful young Black woman, this really pretty young Black woman, and she starts complaining to him. She's in tears. She's complaining because her Jewish fiance has run off, has jilted her. And he's looking at her, and she's just beautiful, this Black woman complaining. And he just finds the whole thing hysterically funny. And then she went after he sort of, but he's been very nice to her back, obviously, and he's been so nice that she ventures to say, well, I'd like you to make a donation to my church. And he finds out that she's a Baptist. And he says, now, dear reader, I hate a Baptist more than anything. And I'm reading this and I think, these people are my relatives, Mr. Trollope. This is exactly what I came from.
Yes.
And it's like Mr. Slope and Mrs. Prudy are very much within the church, within the established church. They're not outside of it, but they're as near to the outside. When Mr. Slope leaves, when Mrs. Prudy kicks him to the curb, as you can see, he goes and starts his own little, what we call in Jamaica, washfoot church. Somewhere out in some unfashionable part of London, and he finds, a rich widow of some sort of minor capitalist to marry. And that world, Trollope has, that is not society. That's outside of society. Society is within the established church. Okay. Yes. Except for maybe a little bit of Methodism, a very little bit.
But they'd like to take over. I mean, Mrs. Prouty would have liked to kick all the high church people to the curb and run the show herself.
The division within the idea that there was an established church is something that comes out over what? After 100 years of like serious fighting and bickering, and it's out of the, you had to have the church was divided into what they call the clergymen. There were a whole class of clergymen who refused to sign on to the 39 articles of the Church of England, the things that you were supposed to believe, the absolute minimum of things you were required to believe if you were a member in good standing of the clergy. And there were these 39 articles. And if you refused to subscribe to them because you thought they were too papist, then you weren't in, you got kicked out. And in the lead up to the Civil War, the church bureaucracy, which had a lot more legal power, range of legal powers than it had now, made the dissenting people's lives a misery.
Mm-hmm.
Also, a lot of these people were like really unpleasant. They were really unpleasant, right? So after the Civil War, after they've killed Charles I, and the Puritans run everything under Cromwell, the whole dictatorship. By the time you get to the end of the dictatorship of Cromwell, everybody hates them. Everybody hates them. And honestly,
They destroyed all the stained glass.
Well, for
Everywhere
starters,
you go in England and you say, look at a church, and they say, oh, well, we had a lovely stained glass window until Cromwell came.
Maybe it just helps to say that they were all the people that got shipped here.
Yeah. That might explain something, yes.
I mean, they were really unpleasant. I try reading. I dip into the history of the 17th century because it's really important, and I'm going to tell you why in a second.
Yes.
But I keep going back into it. There's a character called the Earl of Clarendon who was part of the court of Charles II. But he was in exile with the court, came back, made a lot of money, and then lost it all, and wrote a history of the revolution and the aftermath. But especially of the Civil War and the lead up to the Civil War. And I have been unable to finish this book. It's written in beautiful 17th century prose. There isn't a lot of beautiful 17th century prose, but his is full of really shrewd political insight. And I get to where he starts describing these Puritan people who start turning up with all their rage. And I can't go on because I'm like, I don't think I can live with this guy for like 500 more pages. That these people have power, the feeling that these are the people who are going to get the power. Well, unfortunately, now we can experience that in real life.
Yes.
Not just in sort of our historical imagination, but essentially one of the things that was, if you were a dissenting minister, you got hounded, you had to pay fines, there's all this stuff. So they're just baiting each other, both sides, really. And then after the Restoration, all the people who basically stuck to who wouldn't subscribe, who belonged to these washfoot churches that were associated with political radicalism and regicide, they just shipped them out. Because they had this big empty country over here on the other side of the island, not out the ocean, not actually empty, but and they just shipped them out. It was like, okay, this is a great way to decompress. And you remember Samuel Johnson saying to somebody, sir, I perceive you are a vile Whig. This is why they were considered vile, because these people were so annoying.
Yes.
So annoying. And this is what's coming in. This is why Mrs. Prudy's grates on people, why Mr. Sloat especially. He is the embodiment of all of those qualities.
Because we have all that religious side, and then the background, which you don't get. It's background, I think, in a number of novels, the various reform movements that were going on. So in some ways, I keep looking those up. But the thing about Trollope is you don't need to know those things. So let me ask you, if you have someone, you meet someone and somehow Anthony Trollope comes up and they say, well, I'd read one. How would you suggest that someone start with?
I always recommend Barchester Towers. Barchester Towers is like funny. It's funny from page 1.
Yes.
Right? You're second chapter in, right? The archdeacon, like the highest living church official in the whole area, just called the bishop's wife a cow. I mean, this is how you begin. All right.
Yeah.
You don't need to know church history to know why, but or the English political history. But the other thing that something else you have to understand about Trollope is Trollope doesn't know everything, but Trollope knows everything that everybody knows.
Very good.
That's very good.
And he said he didn't know anything about. He didn't know any archdeacons. He didn't know how church hierarchy worked, except he checked a couple times. He didn't. He had no.
But it was not part of his experience. What about he does have various characters who long to be members of Parliament. Did he long to be a member of Parliament?
Yes, that was one of his frustrated, maybe the sole frustrated ambition of his life. Was that he did that campaigning, that odd British campaigning
Yep.
for a district that he had nothing to do with, and he did not win. And there's, the buying the votes and the not buying the votes. And
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The politicking is actually really fun to
Great
read about.
fun.
he
Yeah.
lost. That was the disappointment. And part of the reason for the Phineas Finn books is because he'd lost.
Mhm.
It was a way for him to write about politics and get involved.
There's just
He said,
he was, he was you look at photographs of him and he's this Victorian man with whiskers, and he obviously had so much feeling. When I think about, the ambitions, the passions, the jealousies, all the rest, they're so full of life, which would have appealed to Mr. Mudrick. Obviously, that's what he was looking for.
I think that what you just described is a feature of the Victorian novel generally, and its great strength was, and I don't know how to account for it, but you see it in Thackeray, you see it in Dickens, you see it in Trollope, even see it in George Eliot, kind of attenuated in Eliot, but it's very much there. There's the sense of a world. It's a shared world, and it's a shared world that their readers immediately recognize. You remember a few years ago that Thomas Piketty book on debt? Do you remember how that book opens? He begins by talking about how everybody in the 19th century who read a Trollope novel basically was able to judge whether Trollope knew exactly what a living income was, a livable income was. Everybody knew. That's what I mean when I say what people know, what everybody knew. Everybody knew what a competent living was. Trollope's writing to a bunch of people who he writes, and Dickens does the same thing to very different effect, but they're both doing it. They're both writing in a grand style that presumes that their audience has read Shakespeare, is intimately conversant with the Bible from church, possibly twice on Sunday, and prayers in the house, a Bible reading starting the day in your house every morning. And whether you believe a word of it or not doesn't matter.
Yeah,
You've got it memorized. It's like when I grew up in Jamaica, the housekeepers would quote the Bible at you when they were telling you to behave. They had it memorized. It was the same thing. It was continuous, that culture. And so there's this, maybe a little bit of Pope, but also a sort of bog standard record of English history in which the Revolution features, the Norman Conquest features, Alfred and the Cakes features, the Glorious Revolution features, and so on. There's all these sort of key moments in history. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, these huge events, right? And everybody's life is kind of, history is kind of these sort of is this sort of continuum with these big bulges in it, and everybody knows they're really part of the collective memory. And that collective memory infuses the literature in what comes to be known as the grand style. I'm talking about the grand style in prose, but it's drawing things from poetry. Like Dickens's Mr. Pecksniff is always like mangling grand style, classical allusions, and history. I was thinking about the one that was cracking me up today was when he was talking to Mrs. Todgers, the boarding house lady, and he's very, very drunk, and he's telling her he can't keep his feelings repressed. They're like the two princes in the tower, and the more he presses on them with the bolster, the more they peep around it. And he's drunk. He's just trying to convince himself that he's in love with her, only because he's drunk.
Yeah.
It's like one of the funniest things in Dickens. They have this pool of shared knowledge of things that you could assume everybody knew about history, from the Bible, from classical literature, and so on.
But isn't it interesting that we can read? I don't know that any of the other, except I think Jane Austen is very accessible. I think even my Chinese friends have read Jane Eyre.
Jane Austen, yeah. Well, Jane.
But Dickens is not as accessible to a modern reader. There's something about Trollope that's so accessible.
Well, I think one of the reasons Dickens is less accessible is because his writing is so densely elusive. Trollope is much more controlled in his use of allusions. He's not going to go nuts with anything, really, the way Dickens will. And Dickens is writing a kind of mad poetry, like the opening of Martin Chuzzlewit or the opening of A Christmas Carol, you know. Trollope's not going to indulge in those kind of shenanigans, you know. But it's interesting to me to think, Bob, of how the Russians jumped on Dickens. The 19th century Russians jumped on Dickens. So Dickens translated into Russian, all right.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about Russian fiction because, like, there's nothing. Suddenly there's like Pushkin, and then there's kind of, and then there's Dickens, and Russian fiction in the 19th century kind of comes out of Dickens and Pushkin, you know, and maybe Thackeray, and like they pick something up. They pick something up that Pushkin picked up, which is this interior life, being able to represent the interior life, and they had a use for it. So they take off with that. With that.
So that came out of, well, that sounds like a
Am I wrong? I may be wrong about
another
that,
conversation. We might.
Yep, I'm wrong, or
No, that's good. But I just learned something, which was so obvious. I'll just say this: the Russians were not building everything out of the Bible.
No, they were not.
British literature had come out of, and they had Pushkin, and then somebody like Dickens, who, I mean, Dostoevsky got so much out of Dickens
because it's the lyricism. It's the lyricism. It's that you're not just doing a plot; you're thinking.
Mm-hmm. So it's different. Although I was pleased to read that Tolstoy had read Trollope, and
he loved Trollope.
So that,
good on him.
That was nice to see in one of these Mudrick's essays. These essays that Mr. Mudrick wrote about a couple of books about Trollope and about the short stories are really good, and I'll make sure to link to those in the show notes too.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. What a blast.
Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at KarenChristensen.substack.com.